Everyone, and welcome to our now second edition of our virtual conferences, our second week. So thank you all for joining us, and thanks to those of you who were there last week, and hopefully we'll continue to see you. But this one is one that I've certainly been looking forward to quite a bit, and really excited to be here today and with the founder of Conscious Capitalism. And Raj wrote his original book called Firms of Endearment back in 2007 that kicked off this whole movement. And so Raj actually was at Babson College at the time, or at Bentley College at the time, and he was looking at some of these companies as a marketing professor, looking at many companies who are spending money on marketing and not getting as much return as they used to. And he tells a story that he had a professor or a mentor of his that said, well, what if instead of looking at all the companies spending a lot and not getting a lot from it, what if instead we looked at these companies that weren't spending as much and we're still having good returns and good outcomes? And so that's what led to this research that was done for Firms of Endearment. You've all heard me probably mention many times that conscious capitalism is based on 4 key tenets, and it came from that research study where there's a higher purpose beyond just making profits. There's a stakeholder orientation that balances the needs of the customers, the community, the employees, the environment, all of these stakeholders that really surround and support the long-term viability of the business. There's also then a conscious leadership, these servant leaders that aren't that command and control, but are really trying to empower their people. And they live the purpose and the culture of the organization. And then that conscious culture is the 4th element. And that's really where these organizations really in a holistic sense are part of the well-being of their employees, really focused on that. And so it's great to see now that this latest iteration there's been many books in between, but the latest iteration is the Healing Organization. And funny enough, in around January timeframe in the BC before coronavirus times, we are thinking about naming this conference the Healing Force of Business, but we were wondering whether that would resonate with the people that we have, in our community, whether that would resonate with them. And then after everything that's happened in the few months that feels like a few years or more since, there's clearly, whether we're talking about our racial divisions, whether we're talking about economic disparities, whether we're talking about the planet, this is a time for healing. And so we're really excited that Raj was able to join us today. So really quickly, just before we get started, I wanted to mention that this is a collaboration of the Conscious Capitalism chapter of Rochester and of the Syracuse, Utica area. And so Rochester has visionary partners of the Accelerate team, Clean Craft, the Bonadillo Group, and sustaining partners, Benefit Link, Home Leasing, Nazareth College, SWBR, 2 Point Capital Management, and Grit Health. And the Syracuse chapter has commitments from Loretto, from Mohawk Global Logistics, from Chobani, also from Clean Craft, from Gilroy, Kernan, and Gilroy, and from Center State CEO. So we really couldn't do this without you, without that support. And really our vision in this region is to say, if conscious capitalism is not only doing these great things for the planet, for its employees, for all the stakeholders, the community, but it also ends up having a positive impact on the bottom line, both in the profits of the organization, and oftentimes that's through the engagement of the employees, that's through their longevity and less turnover. And so we really believe that if it can have a positive impact on the bottom line of a company, what if we as a region in this upstate New York region came to be known for a more conscious way of doing business or a more healing way of doing business? What could that mean for our regional economy? Could it be a regional economic development strategy? Could it be a regional strategy for attracting talent and recruiting people to our area? And so we're really excited to have Raj here today. The last thing I'll mention before we move forward is just to make sure to shoot some questions into the chat box. Raj will be on for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll actually open up for about a half an hour of questions from the audience. So really looking forward to that portion. So make sure to get your questions in. And without further ado, I will knock it over to Raj.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you for organizing this. I miss being there in person. I have many fond memories of coming to Rochester a few times. at your annual events and also before that. So great to be with all of you this afternoon. I'm going to be sharing my thoughts mostly from the Healing Organization book, and then we'll open up for some conversation about all of this. Okay, let me just share my screen here. Who can share? Okay, it's asking me some questions about who can share. So only host. Okay.
It's looking good. We can see it.
You can see it? Okay, good. Let me just minimize
this.
Hey,
Raj,
yeah.
Michael here. I'm going to go ahead and make you host quickly.
Okay.
And then actually, Andrew, if you could do that. You know what? Actually, co-host. I see your screen.
I made him
okay.
co-host.
Okay, great.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So the title again, Healing Our World, and what is the role that business has to play? You know, as we all realize, we're going through a pretty tumultuous time, a highly unusual time, but it's also a time of great opportunity. I think there's a lot of simultaneous awakenings that have been happening in our world in the last couple of years, and this has simply accelerated some of those things. You know, whether it was having to do with the economic crisis, the health crisis, the social justice types of issues. You know, in recent years, we've also had issues around the Me Too movement coming to the fore. So the awakening around the consciousness of business. There's just a lot going on. So I think we're at one of those turning points in history. I think the last one was 1989. When we had a whole bunch of things that came together. And I think this is probably as significant a time that we're going through. You already know about my background. For those of you who don't know, I think Andrew told a little bit of the story. My entree into this after a couple of decades of being a sort of uninspired and somewhat unhappy marketing professor was to start to actually, instead of pointing out everything that was wrong, start to look for how to do it well, how to do it right. So a book that started as In Search of Marketing Excellence, as Andrew described, became firms of endearment, companies that are loved not only by customers, but by everybody. And what makes that happen? The four pillars, right? There's a reason why they exist. They care about the well-being of all stakeholders, and they have leaders who are motivated by those things, and they have cultures where people actually look forward to their work lives and they thrive when they are there. So that is kind of the beginning, and then we had Conscious Capitalism. The book came out in 2013. The movement started in 2008. I've explored the idea of the feminine, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today, as sort of being a big missing element in the world of business, and probably a significant factor in the rise of conscious capitalism is the embrace of so-called feminine values or feminine energy. And then a book with Bob Chapman around taking these ideas into the industrial heartland, saying this doesn't just apply to Whole Foods and Google and companies like that, that small manufacturing companies in Phillips, Wisconsin can also embrace ideas like this and see a dramatic turnaround as a result of that. And then, of course, we have the field guide about how to do all this that came out in 2018. And then the more recent book, The Healing Organization, which I'm going to talk about today. Before we do that, I've just articulate my purpose, which is linked to this topic today, is to bring heart, healing, and soul to business and leadership so we can build a better world for everybody. A world that has to work for everybody. Everybody matters and everybody needs to win. And we do that not by continuing to think about business in the old ways, but by injecting these things, heart, healing, soul, have been missing from the world of business. It's all been an intellectual exercise as well as an exercise rooted purely in financial self-interest. And we need to broaden out from that considerably. Of course, we are living through a tumultuous time with this pandemic and everything that has followed. But one of the silver linings, I suppose, you know, what is the sort of the medicine within the virus, is that it's showing us a lot. It's holding up a mirror to us, for example, as society, that we have been operating in a certain way, right? And that way is not going to continue. So in a way, we've had a collective heart attack, and now we are forced to examine how we've been doing everything. You could also say Mother Nature has kind of put us in time out and say, okay, think about everything that we've been doing and how we've been doing it. And what makes us think that we can continue to do things that same way and endure on this planet and ensure a bright future for future generations. So it's a time for challenging dogma in every aspect of life. but certainly in the aspect of what is the role of business and what has been the role of business in contributing to the suffering that exists on the planet, and what is the role of business going forward. And to me, ultimately, it boils down to this idea that it's a reminder to us, that business, first of all, we human beings are here on this planet to take care of each other. I think we have to first start with thinking about that idea. Are we here to take care of each other? Is that one of our highest callings? And if so, then we can think about business as a way to do that at scale. In our normal lives, we can take care of a small number of people, but through starting a business, we can take care of many, many more, right? And that is the deepest source of meaning and fulfillment, and therefore happiness for human beings. This is what we're intended to come here and do with this life. Now, as we think about the times we are in, and not just the post-COVID, but just sort of zooming out a little bit overall, these modern times that we are in, and look at where we are and take stock of our journey as human beings. I'm reminded of Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities, where he talked about it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It's the age of wisdom and foolishness, season of light and darkness, spring of hope, winter of despair. Right? Think about all of those things as they apply to our current time. By many measures, there has never been a better time to be born a human being. If you look at life expectancy, if you look at literacy, if you look at percentage of people living in freedom, right? If you look at per capita income, all of those indicators, even if you look at the percentage of people who suffer from violence, all of those indicators are at historic highs. In other words, they are better than they've ever been, right? And so therefore you would not choose another time to be born in the history of humanity. And yet at the same time, we know that we are also living through a set of existential crises, not just one of them, unlike anything we've ever faced in the past, right? So we're looking at very dramatically different roads ahead of us. If we continue down the path we've been on, which has given us many of those positive things, but it's not what's going to take us where we need to go. And if we choose wisely and start operating with care and consciousness in the future, then there's no limit to what we can continue to do and how we can evolve. But if we continue blindly down the same path, we will actually go down that dark road, because we may not see out this century in the way that we are going. Sorry, my computer is lagging. Oops, wow. So life is beautiful and filled with joy. I think we all acknowledge that. We experience that every day. But at the same time, life is also tragic and filled with suffering. Sorry, my computer is acting a little funny here. Why do I say that? There's a lot of suffering in the world still. I think the last time I looked, something like 17,000 children die every day from preventable causes. There's still 1 billion people living in extreme poverty. There's still, which is $1.90 a day, there's still about 3 billion people living on less than $3.50 a day. So a lot of people in this world are struggling just to survive, just to stay alive, just to meet their basic needs. So there's a lot of need for alleviating suffering and healing in the world. There's this Steven Pinker who's written The Better Angels of Our Nature, as well as the book Enlightenment Now. And as he points out, what I said earlier, right, that we are living in the best of times in terms of what we have achieved so far, right? Prosperity has gone up, violence has gone down, all the other things that have happened. But at the same time, if you look at psychic suffering and planetary suffering, those are on the rise. Right? If you look at what's happened with anxiety, depression, drug addiction, opioid epidemics, suicides, all these things have gone up dramatically in the last few decades, even as other indicators of well-being have gone up as well, right? And this is especially true in the more prosperous countries. So we are facing some kind of a crisis here. There's a tremendous amount of suffering, despite what on the surface looks like things are pretty good. And then, of course, planetary suffering, which may be the biggest issue that we are collectively facing at this time. It's funny to realize that humans are the only species that systematically is destroying its own habitat and decimating other species. That's what we've been doing for the last century, all for the sake of economic prosperity and self-indulgence. We have assumed that we cannot realize economic prosperity without those things, and that was our paramount concern. But we haven't looked at the consequences of what that really means. I was somewhat amused that the Earthwatch Institute recently looked at all of the living beings on the planet and said the bee is the most important living creature, way more important than human beings in terms of the flourishing of the whole system. We are a net negative to the flourishing of all other life here. That has to change, if we're going to continue here. So think about the last century. This is the century of modern living, right? Most of the modern things that we take for granted were invented here, whether it's cars or flight or, or all the electronics, or everything else, right? A century of modern living. It's great what it has given us. But what else has happened in that time? That 80% of the natural forests that existed 100 years ago are gone. That 30% of the land that we use to produce food is no longer usable. That 90% of the large mammals, the lions, the tigers, the rhinoceros, are gone. That 95% of the large fish in the ocean are gone. So while we are decimating those life forms, we have huge numbers of animals that are living in factory farms, living and dying, right, in factory farms. And if you just peek behind that curtain, it's sort of a horrifying story that there are 75 billion animals and 100 billion fish are killed annually after living on factory farms, right? And that's in addition to another trillion wild fish. And of course, we know the conditions that these animals live under, the crowding, the caging, what they are fed, which is unnatural to their species, and how they are bred, to develop certain characteristics. I mean, their life is literally living hell. For the vast majority of them, and then they die, and that becomes part of our food system. So that's a lot of suffering that we are inflicting on other species. We also have the fifth mass extinction in the history of this planet going on right now. And this is the first one that's caused largely by human activity. That every day about 100 species go extinct, and half of all the species that are alive today are likely to be gone in the next 50 years. And at the same time, the toxic burden on human bodies is growing. So it's interesting, even though our life expectancy has gone up, but so has the incidence of many diseases, right? And we're sort of prolonging life in certain ways, but the quality of life is not great for a lot of people. If you look at cancer, the incidence of cancer in the US was about 22 or 23% of Americans could expect to get cancer in their lifetimes. This was reported in the 1980s during the Reagan administration. And then if you look at in the 2000s during the Obama administration, that number had risen to about 43% of Americans could expect to get cancer, including 50% of men and 33% of women. Right? So a disease that was rare a century ago has now become almost commonplace. Half of all men are expected to get it. And this is as a result of all the chemicals, right? The average newborn baby has 187 known carcinogens in their cord blood. So this is the way in which we've been living, and all the chemicals are adding up and accumulating. And of course, we have diabetes and obesity and many other public health crises as well. So the toxic burdens on human beings has been rising. And a lot of this is the pollution that's caused by business. Pollution kills 9 million people every year. That's way more than people who are killed by wars and terrorism and civil strife and so forth. The environmental cost of that, in addition to the human cost, right? All these lives that are lost and other lives that are shortened and damaged. But there's also an actual physical cost of $4.7 trillion a year associated with the environmental damage that we're causing. So that's a lot of suffering that's out there. Right, planetary suffering, other species, our own psychic suffering, and then the continued state of poverty that a lot of people live under. So I believe the need for healing is paramount. We need to heal ourselves. A lot of us are carrying around traumas from our childhood that we have never fully examined, and then they end up impacting our behavior in the world. If we don't heal ourselves, we actually cannot heal others. And this is something maybe we come back to in the Q&A. I had to go through my own healing in order to write this book. I was told by 3 people who I trust that you need to work on yourself before you can write about healing. And I think the same is true of leaders. If we aspire to be healing leaders, we have to heal ourselves. We need to heal our families and our communities. We know how much division exists. Nowadays, our companies, there's a lot of healing that's necessary there in terms of the suffering that's going on now and what's happened in the past. And our countries. There's so many countries that have never been more divided than they are today, whether it's the US or Brazil or India or many other countries. You see that the divisions are deep. We need to heal our planet and its ability to sustain life. I mean, that's probably the most existential crisis before us. And we need to heal the past, the present, and the future. If you think about what's going on right now with the civil unrest around Black Lives Matter and so forth, this is really about unhealed wounds from the past. Of course, there are things that happened recently, but really it's saying this has been going on for 400 plus years. And we haven't fully acknowledged the traumas that people have endured and their generations of their families have endured, and have never really apologized or made amends for that. So if you look at the truth and reconciliation process that happened in South Africa after the end of apartheid, that went a long way in healing that society from its horrific multi-century past of brutality against much of their population. We've never gone through something like that here, really. And hence the need for doing that. You can't really heal in the present if you don't heal the past. But in the present moment, you have this tremendous opportunity and power to actually heal the past. And by so doing, lay the groundwork for healing the present. And of course, from there, we can continue to heal into the future. But given the paramount need for healing, I believe we all need to be healers now. It's a way to think about ourselves. It doesn't matter if you're a lawyer or a doctor or a professor or a business leader. In some way, you are a healer, or you can be if you choose to be a healer. Because as the Dalai Lama has said, our prime purpose in this life is to help others. And if we can't help them, at least don't hurt them. And unfortunately, we have been inflicting so much suffering on each other. Just look at the century past, right? And how many people were killed by other human beings, whether it was two world wars and many other wars and all the other things that we did. Extraordinary levels of suffering have been inflicted by us and each other. We need to change that. Because if you don't consciously choose to be part of the healing, we are probably part of the hurting. Most people initially can take offense at what I'm saying because I don't set out to hurt anybody. I'm just doing my job and I'm providing employment and I'm doing all these important things. It's true. But at the same time, if you don't actually look at the impact of what you're doing on people's overall well-being, you actually might be missing what is actually going on. So if you don't consciously choose the path of healing, you will unconsciously be on the path of hurting. You will be causing more stress and more suffering to the people whose lives you touch. How do we change this? As James Baldwin has said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So we have to face up to the reality of what is actually happening and what has happened as a result of our actions. And when we see that it has caused suffering, then we will be inspired to change. So here's one consequence of what we've been doing in business. Heart attacks are 20% higher on Mondays. There are two studies that I've seen, one here and one in the UK. Our work is literally killing us. This is the human cost of doing business that we're talking about that doesn't get factored in anywhere. Jeffrey Pfeffer's book that came out a couple of years ago estimated 120,000 Americans die every year due to stress related to work, not the work itself. These are not occupational safety and health types of things. This is actually the stress that's connected with how we lead, manage, and organize. Look at a country like China. China and Japan, they've had to invent new words to define death from overwork. This never used to exist before, but it's estimated that 600,000 Chinese die every year from overwork. Let's all think about that the next time we look at a product made in China. What was the human cost of suffering that went into that product at the price that we are asked to pay for it, right? So again, the human cost of doing business. And the great irony and the sad, bitter irony to me is that even our healing professions have become places of suffering because of the way we run our organizations. Doctors, nurses, veterinarians, dentists, and they have higher rates of depression, drug addiction, and suicide. Doctors kill themselves at twice the overall rate. Now think about that. It's a person who's living their life's purpose. They're doing healing work. They're literally saving other lives. And yet they're themselves so miserable that they're killing themselves at a higher rate. There's something wrong here. The way we work isn't working. And we need to step back. And I think what we're going through right now with COVID and everything else is a great opportunity for us to actually step back and say, wow, what are we doing? And how can we change that and make it better. Now, I'd like to actually introduce an idea here, which is in the first part of the book. You know, if you look at why did we get here and how did we end up causing so much suffering in the world, I think it really has to do with an imbalance of these energies that exist. And there are four of them, the four archetypal energies that exist. There's the masculine energy, right? There's feminine energy. So there's sort of the strength, courage, discipline, focus, etc. And again, not to say this is male or female. This is just saying we call those things as so-called masculine energy, feminine energy of love, care, compassion, empathy, inclusiveness. Then there's elder energy. This is our higher self. This is our divine self, right? And as we acquire wisdom, right, we can also then live a life of meaning and purpose and manifest the wisdom that human beings are capable of. And then there's also child energy. You know, we all have within us an inner child. And for many of us, that is a wounded inner child, because things happen when you're young, right? And if you don't heal that, then we have this wounded inner child that then tends to drive how we behave and how we show up. A lot of the aggression and violence that we see in society is because of those unhealed childhood wounds. But a healed child gives us access to innocence and joy and creativity and humor and playfulness, etc. Right? So again, those are the four energies that can show up in their positive, healthy form, which is on the top line, or they can show up in their negative aspects. So you can have the hyper-masculine, which is domination, aggression, competition, hyper-competition, winning, results at all costs. Hyper-feminine, which could get sentimental, needy, dependent. The unhealthy elder energy, which is reflected in dogma and division, sort of, superstition, etc. Blind faith. And then we can have the unhealthy child energy, which is sort of adolescent and self-indulgent energy. And so the key here is to stay within the positives of each of these and cultivate them all. The phrase that we use is we need to become the wise fools of tough love. We have wisdom, we have foolishness, which is the child energy, we have the toughness, and we have the love all at the same time, right? So that's kind of the ideal. And it's the absence of those energies on the top that then result in suffering. Now, if you think about where the United States started, you know, it was founded by a bunch of Enlightenment thinkers, right? And so it brought in that mature masculine energy that was starting to be evident in Europe as well, right? The Scottish Enlightenment and others. And it was also a very religious country. And so you also had kind of that elder energy, but it was a kind of religion which was rooted more, you know, the Quakers and others, a purpose and wisdom, right? So it was kind of the founding of the US was based upon these two ideas. But of course, the feminine was completely missing, as was the child energy. So if you look at the feminine, right? So when John Adams was working on the Declaration and subsequently also on the Constitution, and they're trying to create the system of government for the United States, his wife Abigail wrote to him in what has now become a classic, very famous letter. And she said, remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. And you can read the rest. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sexes are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. Right? So again, making a strong case that you're creating this country from a blank sheet of paper. Don't make the mistake that everybody else has done, which is somehow sideline half of humanity and not give them any representation in the government. And of course, John Adams gets this. So she's in Boston, he's in Philadelphia, and he writes back to her. So that was March 31st. This is April 14th. So not bad turnaround. So we have been told that our struggle has loosened the bonds of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardian, and, referring to Negroes growing insolent. In other words, because we are seeking freedom, everybody wants freedom, it seems. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, was grown discontented. In other words, the women, right? And then, of course, he brushes it off. Depend upon it. We know better than to repeal our masculine systems, right? We would not subject ourselves to the despotism of the petticoat. So that was kind of a brush off to say, not really, this is not happening, right? And then Abigail writes back 3 weeks later. Whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. But you must remember that arbitrary power is like most other things which are hard. It's very liable to be broken. And we have it in our power not only to free ourselves, but to subdue our masters and without violence throw both your natural and legal authority at our feet. So again, all of this fell on on deaf ears. And think about it, it was 1920 before women got the right to vote. So that's another 144 years from now. In fact, we're right close to the anniversary of that, I think, next month. Right? So this democracy was not a real democracy. The key point I'm trying to make here is that the feminine was completely missing from democracy. Right? It was completely, and when you have the missing feminine, then the masculine becomes a hyper-masculine, becomes a negative aspect of that. And simultaneous with the evolution of democracy in this country was the evolution of capitalism. So capitalism too evolved in the same way. First of all, women could not start businesses. They couldn't own businesses. Women technically did not exist as separate beings. They were subsumed under their father, and from there they went to being subsumed under their husband's identity. They could not inherit property. They could not buy things or have them in their own names. They could not sign legal documents. It's extraordinary to think about it today. And so capitalism also evolved with hyper-masculine energy. We left out the feminine caring side of business. You know, Adam Smith also wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments in addition to writing The Wealth of Nations. Wealth of Nations was about self-interest, right, and freedom. I view that as kind of father energy. And then there was the moral sentiments, theory of moral sentiments, the human need to care. I say capitalism had a mother and a father. They were both Adam Smith. But of course, we ignored that mother energy, that feminine energy. So I think that's what you had is a hyper-masculine energy in both of these critical things that define our society, democracy and capitalism, and hence all the suffering that ensues from there. You know, unions, socialism, Marxism, communism, all arose as a response to lower consciousness, hyper-masculine capitalism, when people started being used and abused, right, to maximize profits. And not just here, in the UK and other places as well, right? So, and this is, if you look at where we are today in this society, I would say largely our national culture is sort of defined by sort of this hyper-masculine energy, right? We are the most aggressive nation in the world, right, in terms of, you know, military engagements. We also have a higher percentage of our population in prison, right? So we have that, and then we have a lot of dogma and division. We don't have the positive aspects of the elder energy. There's sort of, you know, fundamentalism when it comes to religion, and with the, you know, we're sort of in that adolescent rather than that innocent sort of mode. So we have some work to do here. We need to really evolve our national character towards this more holistic way of being. So what we have, I would say, predominantly is so-called angry father energy, right? Selfishness, greed, exploitation, domination, etc., etc. Everything becomes a battle when that's the dominating energy. And we see it in our society. Everything is a fight. Everything is a debate. There's no dialogue. So what we need is wholeness, right? And that's what those four things coming together is, sort of the father energy, the mother energy, the elder energy, and the child energy. So I think that's what we need to aspire towards. And that's wholeness. By the way, so the word healing has two roots. One is holy, and the other is wholeness. So if we think about that, we need to become whole. We need to heal the divisions that exist within us. And when we do that, we will heal. And we need to recognize the sort of divine aspect of what it means to be a human being. And therefore, we need to treat each other with that same kind of, with the same respect, right, that we would accord divinity. Now, the good news is that if you do it right, business can actually do all this. Business can alleviate suffering and elevate joy. There's nothing inherent in work that says it has to be a place of suffering. That work is inherently hard and it's going to damage our psyches and our bodies. In fact, if you do it right, business can actually do the opposite of that. We can alleviate suffering and elevate joy. So this is not about healing businesses. This is not saying we need more yoga studios and massage parlors and all kinds of businesses like that. This is saying business itself can be done as a healing activity. It doesn't matter what business is. So business as healing rather than business as using, right? Business as exploiting, which is what a lot of business is. Can we do business in a way that serves people, that takes care of people? And if you do all that, then business actually can be a place of healing for those who work there. You can leave at the end of the day physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and socially in a better place than when you came into work. Business can be a source of healing for those we serve, our customers and our communities. Their lives can be enriched and made better. And it can be a force for healing in society. Businesses can show how very, very different people, different ages, different ethnicities, different religions, different political views, come together with shared purpose and shared values and do extraordinary things. And it shows us how we can work together and how we can heal society from there. So the first part of the book is how did we get here? How did we cause all this suffering? The second part is really the examples of stories. We have about 25 stories of companies that actually are the opposite. Not only are they not causing suffering, they are actually healing their people. And one of the stories is the parable of the pothole. And I'd like to start with this because it illustrates a very general point. All of the stories do. This one in particular, because if you think about most companies and most workplaces, there's kind of a caste system that exists. You know, I come from India, where there's one of the worst things about India is the caste system, that you're born into these different levels or stratas within society and you're kind of locked into that. But in businesses, what do we find? We have the salaried, professional, usually college educated, full-time people on the one hand, and that might be 10-15% of the overall employee base in many companies. And then you have the hourly paid people who actually do the work, whatever the work is, who are often not college educated, and they are hourly paid. They don't have very many benefits. They don't have retirement, right? And many of them are part-time. And if you look at life for these two groups, so you can look at a company and say, this is our culture, this is our turnover, this is our engagement level, okay? But if you then divide it up and say, okay, what is the engagement level for salaried versus hourly? What is the turnover for salaried versus? You find drastically different pictures. So there's a company called Apple Tree Answers, which is the second largest call center company. And as the CEO, John Ratliff, grew this company through acquisition, and he started to look at some of the indicators more systematically, he looked at the employee engagement and turnover data, and he found a dramatic difference between these two groups. That for the salaried professional people, engagement was in the 60s and turnover was in the teens. That's not bad. But for the hourly workers, engagement was in the teens, like 15% or so, and turnover was 118%. In other words, they only lasted on average about 9 or 10 months before they left the company on their own accord. Right? So naturally, they're disengaged and not very productive and not very happy. And he said, wow, that seems pretty bad, right? And he was flying to an industry conference and he asked somebody, I want to learn how I can improve this. And the guy said, well, the industry average is 158%. So you're actually doing well. We need to learn from you. And he said, no, that's not acceptable. So he went back and started asking his people, tell me, what can we do to make your work life better? Right? And one of the first things they got was the chairs are terrible. We end up with a backache every day. So, oh my God, we didn't know. So we're going to replace all the chairs. And now he started asking every day, please tell us something that we can do to make your experience better here. So they started making a lot of incremental changes. But soon he realized that fundamental to all of this was the fact that all these people are living on the edge of ruin. You know, in America, about 2/3 of people work on hourly jobs. And it's about close to 100 million people. And the vast majority of them are paycheck to paycheck. In other words, they have no savings. There was one statistic that 40 to 50% of Americans have less than $2,000 in the bank. And if they, less than $400 in the bank. And if they needed $2,000 within 30 days, would not be able to come up with it, right? So people are living on the edge of financial ruin because a small thing could happen. It's like if you hit a pothole. So we use the illustration of, let's say the chief financial officer of this company is driving to work one morning, and her Mercedes hits this pothole and her tire blows out and her rim gets damaged, and she pulls over and calls AAA, and they come and they tow the car, and then she gets a ride to her workplace. She arrives about an hour late, and everybody is very solicitous of her. Oh my God, that must have been so shocking. Are you okay? Can I get you some coffee? And later that afternoon, the car is returned to her workplace. It's been repaired, it's been washed and cleaned, and insurance covered most of it. So here's a non-event in her life. And yet people showed her caring and consideration. I said, imagine one of our hourly workers was driving that same road in her $800 16-year-old car and had the same damage to her car. Now, she doesn't have AAA. She can't afford it. And so she has to call around for a towing company to remove the car from the highway. And then she has to call her friends and try to get a ride to work because she can't afford $40 or whatever it's going to cost her if she gets a cab or an Uber. Finally gets to work 3 hours late. And she's told, oh, the supervisor is mad. What took you so long? You know, he's waiting for you. And so she goes in and she gets severely reprimanded. She gets a black mark against her record. And she's told 2 more of these and you will be fired. And at the end of that, she's told, okay, now go answer the phones and be nice to our customers. Now think about the state of mind that this person is in. Her life seems to be falling apart. Right? She has $160 in the bank. She doesn't know how she's going to pay to get her car back. She doesn't know how she's going to come to work tomorrow. She doesn't know how she's going to bring her kids to their school. And yet we kick her when she's down. She gets no empathy and no support. So John thought about all this and said, you know, we're going to create a program here. It's called Dream On, and we're going to help you through life's potholes. Whatever it is, whether it's a health issue, whether it's a car issue, a house issue, whatever it might be, please apply. We were putting aside some money here, and we don't want your life to be derailed by what for many of us would be a small pothole, but for you it becomes a sort of a gigantic incident in your life. So they put that out there, and for 8 days, nothing happened. I said, that can't be true. We know that people need help, but people have a lot of pride. I say people are stoic and people are heroic. They carry around burdens, that would crush many of us, and yet they continue to show up and they do their job to their best abilities, right? It's quite heroic and very touching to me. So 8 days later, they finally get a submission on their website. And one of their full-time women employees writes, and she starts by saying, I am so sorry. She said, my ex-husband stopped paying alimony 2 weeks ago, and a week ago, my 2 kids and I got evicted from our apartment. And I had nowhere to go, and we're just living in the car now. And it's been a week, and I'm so sorry I can't do this to them anymore. I need help. And this showed up on the screen, and John Ratliff read that, and he had tears in his eyes. He said, I felt a deep sense of shame. So what kind of a leader am I, and what kind of a company am I running here? Where a full-time employee who's a mother, is homeless for a week, and she still can't tell us. So of course they reached out to her right away, and they got her into a hotel that night, and they helped her get another apartment within a week, and helped her furnish it and pay the first month and last month. All of those are hurdles that for many people in our country are too big to overcome because you don't have any savings. And then they told her, we can keep this confidential. We don't have to tell anybody if you would rather respect your privacy. And she said, no, nobody has ever done anything this nice for me in my entire life. I'm going to tell everybody I know. And so the word got out, and before you know it, the floodgates opened, and so many people started asking for help, and they helped each one of them. And slowly and surely, the culture of that company started changing. Fast forward 2 years, the annual turnover rate went down from 118% to 16%. Think about that in an industry where the average is 158%. And think about the business consequences of that, right? How much more productive these people are, how much money you save on recruiting and training and so forth. There are always positive business outcomes that come when you put people at the center and treat them with love and care. The second example, I call it serving and uplifting the innocent. There are a lot of people in society who are really used and abused by our system, and they really don't ask for anything. And we just, we take advantage of them because they have no power. They have no bargaining power, and they just have to take what's there. So this is the story of a company called Jaipur Rugs, and it was started by this gentleman, N.K. Chaudhary. And he said, I want to serve the innocents. He said, in the carpet industry, these beautiful hand-woven carpets are made by mostly women, 95-98% women, who come from the weaver community, which is considered a lower caste in India, and many of them are considered untouchable. And he said, these women have never harmed anybody. They have never asked for anything. All they've done their entire life is work and serve other people. He said, I want to serve them. They're the innocents. I want to serve the innocents. So he started a company where he wanted to change the way in which the whole industry operates. What is the typical life of one of these women? I met Shakti when I went to interview Mr. Chaudhary and see some of these facilities. And Shanti's life story was typical. She was born into a weaver family, untouchable family, and she's born a girl into one of those families, which means she's at the lowest of the low totem poles in society in India, right? An untouchable girl child. And You get educated last, if at all. Right? The boys will get educated first, if the family can afford it. And you get fed last with what's left. And then at an early age, you start looking after your siblings and you start helping with household chores. And then when you become 10, 12 years old, you start actually weaving carpets. And then when you're in your mid-teens, you get married to another weaver family. And there you're supposed to do everything you were doing before and weave carpets and have children, right? And cook and clean. And you're abused by your mother-in-law, and you're probably abused by your alcoholic husband, which is pretty common. So the entire life is sort of a tortured existence. So Shanti had 5 children. She was illiterate. She had been abused in all those ways. And even the contractors, so when she was making these carpets, the contractors come from the cities, they bring these designs and they bring the yarn and say, okay, I need this carpet made and I have 90 days and here's what I'll pay you. Right, of course, and then they take the contract, they deliver the carpet, and often they'll point out one small blemish and reduce the fee by 50%, or they will not pay them in time, and there's other kinds of abuse that they do as well. Right, so life is hell for these women. And then she discovered Jaipur ROC, so they found her, and now she's part of that family, and now she's running about 15 women work with her, and she has 4 or 5 of these looms. The Jaipur ROC Foundation has educated her, taught her reading, writing, and basic math skills, accounting skills. She's now essentially a small entrepreneur within their system. She told me, there were times when she had to sell her jewelry in the past in order to feed her kids or to pay some of the other women that she worked with and all the abuse that she suffered. And now, because her life has turned around so dramatically, all her children went to good schools, and now 1 daughter, 4 daughters and a son that she has. One has already graduated college, one is in college, one is in 11th, one is in 10th, and her son is in the 7th grade. 5 children from this illiterate woman, untouchable woman, are now going to graduate from college and have a whole different life experience because Jaipur rugs came into her life. And I asked her, Mr. Chaudhary was sitting there. By the way, he's known as the Gandhi of the carpet industry in India. 40,000 women like Shanti are part of that system. I said, what do you think about him? How do you feel about him? What he's done for you? And she just started crying. She said, I don't have words. But then she said, to me, he's more than my mother and my father. To me, he is God because he gave me life. I didn't have a life before this, and he gave me a life. So again, the extraordinary multi-generational healing impact of a company like Jaipur Rugs, right, on uplifting people. Challenging industry norms. Every industry has certain normal standard operating procedures, and we need to examine those and say, what is the human cost of that? Think about consulting. If you want to be a successful consultant, you have to be prepared to be gone Monday to Friday, most weeks, at the client's site, right? Whether it's McKinsey or Accenture or any of those companies, right? Now, that's fun and exciting when you're young and just out of college, but then you get married and you start to have children. So the founders of this company called JABIAN Consulting were 3 Accenture partners. And as they started to settle down and have children, they said, oh my God, what is this going to mean for my ability to be there with my children if I'm gone Monday to Friday every single week? They would see their colleagues, calling home and singing lullabies and trying to say goodnight, and the sort of heaviness and the guilt around that. And they said, this is not necessary. So we're going to start a new consulting company in Atlanta, and all our clients will be local. Atlanta has plenty of business, and nobody has to travel for work. That'll be the rule, because they said children of employees are stakeholders in our business. They explicitly identified children as stakeholders in the business. I'm sorry, there's some lawn work going on outside. I hope the sound is still okay. And so that's what they did. And then, they started getting inquiries from Dallas and Chicago and Charlotte and significant business opportunities. They just opened new offices in those cities and put consultants there or hire local people, right? And it's made a dramatic difference in the lives of the people who work in this company and their families and their communities. This little company in Atlanta has 3 of the top 20 consultants in the US who choose to work there because of these kinds of policies that they have. Another example is around the idea of confronting social sadness. America is an exceptional country in so many ways. One of the dark aspects, I think, of our society is the criminal justice system, and the fact that so many people get caught up in it. An estimated 70 million Americans have some kind of criminal record, and we have more people in prison than any other country in the world by far, absolute numbers as well as percentage, It's a tremendously harsh and in many cases deeply unjust system. And people's lives are ruined for small things that they do when they are young. So a Zen master named Bernie Glassman said that he wanted to give people a first chance. He said there are many people in our society that don't even get a first chance. They're born into terrible surroundings, they have terrible schools, drugs and violence. They have no shot at life. And then they get caught up in the criminal justice system. And then, 70 million of us have that same number that have a college degree, and most doors are closed to them in terms of opportunities, right? So he said, I'm going to start a company. It's called Greyston Bakery in Yonkers, which, by the way, one of the richest counties in America and one of the highest rates of homelessness. And he said, we don't hire people to bake brownies, we bake brownies to hire people. We're going to create jobs. They practice what they call open hiring. No background checks and no interviews. If you want a job, you put your name on the list, we hire the next person, we train them for 9 months, and then we place them in a job. We get you started on this career trajectory, and then you can leave and go somewhere else and find some other work, right? So the impact of this is dramatic on the lives of people. So many people who had this history, right? This is Dion Drew had been in jail 3 times, and every time he'd come out and look for a job and nobody would give him a job. And so what would he do? He went back, on the streets. He had to survive, right? And now he found Greyston Bakery finally. He has a 6-year-old daughter. He's an apartment. He makes $60,000 a year. He said, my life is completely changed. If it were not for Greyston, I would be dead or back in jail. So that's the power, again, of business to turn people's lives around. Every example I'm using here is a for-profit business. So none of these are nonprofits, right? Nonprofits do noble work in the world, but that's because businesses often create the need for that kind of work because of the suffering that results from the way we operate. Healing Communities, there's a wonderful company called HEB in Texas, which is the largest grocery retailer there, about $25 billion, 100,000 plus employees. Beloved company. There's tremendous Texas pride in this company. They're the largest donor to the state of Texas, right? They have far better wages and lower prices than Walmart. The best place to work in the industry, and they have the lowest prices. Loved by customers, loved by employees, loved by communities. And one of their wonderful things is that when there's a hurricane or other emergency, they show up before the Red Cross and before the FEMA. This was a tweet somebody put out at the time of Hurricane Harvey. I'll see your FEMA and Red Cross and raise you my Texas grocery store chain. They show up, they have helicopters, they have a 365-day a year, 24/7 emergency disaster recovery operation. They will open their stores within a couple of days after they were flooded. They're extraordinary in their ability to be there for their communities. And this was started by the grandmother of the current CEO and Chairman Charles Butt, started by Florence Butt. And it has her giving, loving energy still in the company. And as he tells his executives, please, let's pay our people as much as possible, not as little as possible. Their whole business model is designed around this idea that we're going to pay people, just like Costco does, right? They pay double of Walmart and much better healthcare and so forth. We're going to design a business model that's not predicated on paying people minimum wage or as little as we can get away with. We're going to pay them in a way that they can actually be happy and look after their families, because anything else is not acceptable, right? And then we figure out how to make it work, which we can. There's always a way to do it. So in closing, whether you're a healing organization or a hurting organization, it depends on the leaders. As we've said in Conscious Capitalism, the consciousness of the leader places an upper limit on the consciousness of the organization. And likewise, if you want to be a healing organization, you have to first heal yourself. You have to start by healing yourself. What we say is heal me, serve we, impact the world. It starts from there. So I would encourage all of you, as I did. I took 5 months off before I wrote this book, and I went on some inward journeys of exploration and understanding what needed to be healed within me. So what I feel we need to do is to unleash these 2 things from the corporate closet. There are 2 things that are locked away in most companies. One is the unexpressed caring that we all carry around. I think it's the most abundant resource on the planet is unexpressed caring. Human beings have a need to care. We are simply wired for that. And yet most organizations create cultures where that's not welcome. That's not part of the norm. We're supposed to put on our mask and armor and go to battle and, win. Defeat the competitors and capture market share and do all of those kinds of things. So all of this caring energy has no place to go when it comes to work. And then we have all the silent suffering. As I said, if you could envision a thought bubble over the head of everybody that you meet and just get a glimpse into what they're struggling with. Right now, their mom just got diagnosed with Alzheimer's, their kid got addicted on opioids, or whatever it might be. Life is difficult, and our work makes it harder. So if we can simply be aware of that, if we can unleash both of these things, right, that unexpressed love will find expression in healing that suffering, and everybody's going to be healed. We can unleash a tsunami of healing in our organizations. One thing I know for sure is that the new normal after we emerge from what we are going through right now cannot be the old normal. This is not about going back to rewinding the clock to December 2019. This is about reimagining and re-envisioning everything. This is about opening a new chapter in human history. This is about now becoming a force of healing in the world, not just a force of creating financial wealth. And we end the book with a healing oath that we encourage leaders to take, just like doctors have to take a Hippocratic oath. Why? Because our lives are in their hands. Well, as leaders, people's lives are in our hands as well. And if we don't operate with this mentality, we are going to cause suffering for them and their children and their families and their communities. So there are three aspects to the healing oath. Primum non nocere. We start with some Latin, which means first, do no harm. I will operate my business in a way that causes no harm to others or to Mother Earth. Malus eradicare, root out evil. I will never enable or collude with abuse or exploitation. I will stand up for fairness, truth, beauty, integrity, and basic goodness. And amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. I will operate from love and always measure success by the fulfillment, abundance, and joy I generate for all those whose lives I touch. So these are words to live by, and I really encourage you to think about these if you run a business or if you are in any kind of leadership role. And again, for all of us to think of ourselves, how can I be a force for healing? How can I bring joy? How can I alleviate suffering? How can I promote healthy growth in the world? Thank you very much. I will stop sharing and we'll open it up for comments and questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Raj. Always a pleasure to see the latest iteration of everything that you study and that you share with us as you continue to push conscious capitalism forward. I think one of the things that you mentioned a few times, and we got a couple questions in the comments that might be a good place to start. You mentioned your own healing journey, and I'm not sure how much specifically you want to get into about that journey, but maybe at least talk a little bit about maybe that process that you went through, or maybe some recommendations for those that are wanting to become more healing leaders.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's one of the most important things, that we have a duty actually to ourselves. You know, we have to all recognize, we talk about stakeholders, right? Both companies and individuals have a blind spot, which is themselves. We are our most important stakeholder as individuals, and companies are their own most important stakeholders as companies. In other words, if you don't make sure that the company is strong and resilient and you're investing in the future of that entity, if you're simply extracting value from it, right, for shareholders and for customers and others, then you're going to weaken that entity. Likewise, we are our own most important stakeholders, because if we don't take care of ourselves, we cannot do anything impactful in the world, right? So we have to heal me before I can serve we, right, and impact the world. So in my case, I did not have that realization. I was, all, full steam ahead, going from one project to the next, one airport to the other, and squeezing in this book and doing the interviews and doing the research. And then three women who I really respect independently told me, Raj, you're taking on a pretty serious subject here. This is kind of a sacred undertaking. And we had been using that language to write about healing. We're dealing with human suffering here and planetary suffering. So we need to be very careful with that. We have to do something meaningful, right? So I said, this is a sacred undertaking, and you cannot undertake that until you are ready for that. So if you're not healed yourself, you really can't write about healing with any real validity or credibility. And I resisted. I said, I don't have time for that. And I've got a book deadline, and the whole summer is set aside for that, for writing. I said, no, book deadlines are flexible, And as I said, I heard it from three different people: Lynn Twist, Nilima Bhatt, my co-author on Shakti Leadership, as well as another friend. And I said, I think they're right. So I delayed my book by 5 months. I said yes to several things I had said no to before. So one of them was a journey to the Himalayas in the India-China border with my Shakti leadership group. right? Every year, you go on a journey to some spiritual. This was a very Buddhist destination, and really getting immersed in that, which is all about suffering, right? The Buddhist spiritual tradition is a tremendous amount of wisdom around suffering. And so I spent 8 days there. That's where I turned 60, right? It was a very meaningful experience. Then I also said yes to a silent retreat in upstate New York, actually, not far from where you are, in Peace Village, a place called Peace Village with about 35 people, including Peter Senge and David Cooper Ryder and many others. 4-day silent retreat. And it was an invitation to sort of journey inward and just, be with yourself in nature and see what comes through. And I had like 40 pages of notes by the end of those 4 days. I'd never had such a sort of a rich experience just in terms of what was downloaded to me. That was profound. And then I said yes to Lynn Twist and the Pachamama Alliance to actually go down to Ecuador, to the Amazon rainforest, and spend 10 days with a group of 17 people deep inside the rainforest, getting immersed in the connection to nature, living actually with 2 different indigenous peoples there, the Achuar and the Zapara, experiencing their way of being, their food, their life, and then connecting, as they say, the Western world connects to everything from sort of the head, and we look at the heart and spirit. We connect to not only other people, but to trees and to other living creatures, and even to rocks and stones. Everything we connect at a spirit level, and we recognize that we are from this planet. We don't come into this planet. We're as much a part of the planet as a tree is, and yet we've separated ourselves, and that has led to some deeply unhealthy outcomes as we are experiencing in the world today. So a lot of wisdom there, some shamanic healing rituals, that go back thousands of years, that I'd also did there. And then the last thing was that I worked with a coach for the first time. And this is something I strongly encourage as well for all leaders. And as I told her the story of my life, that I come from this very, I talked about the caste system. I come from the warrior caste in India, which is a very feudal mentality. Is a super hyper patriarchal system. It's feudal, it's misogynistic in many ways, right? So women are kind of subjugated in many ways. And so I kind of experienced that as a child. I lived 5 years in a village, 0 to 5, and I saw all kinds of horrifying things that imprinted on me. And yet my mother had a huge influence on me. So I was kind of brought up by her, because my dad was away getting his college education. I didn't know him until I was 7, actually. So I kind of had this imprint of my mother on me, even though I came from an opposite, the hyper masculine patriarchal system. And then I told her the trajectory of my work, 20 years of unhappy business professor, marketing, et cetera, and then the trajectory starting with firms of endearment and the whole message around love and compassion and care and empathy and all of this in business, and how my purpose kind of found me through that. And after hearing all that, she said, do you realize that you have been honoring your mother with your work for the last 15 years? That for the first 40 years, you were trying to impress your father and be like him. And that's not you. That was not your role to play in this life. And then finally, you got onto your true path, which is to bring her energy, which is a healing energy, right? Caring, loving, which has been missing from the world. See, we have had plenty of that other energy, domination, aggression, winning, empire building, results, numbers, etc. But look at the suffering it has given us. Look at all the wars and people who've died, and look at how we run businesses. We need to balance that out now. So that's that clarified for me even further, right? I lost both my parents last year, and it was such a turning point as well to sort of now step into my full adulthood and recognize what my role is for the rest of my life here, right? So all of that, these were insights, and one of the gifts of all of that experience, in addition to helping me with this book, is actually I generated a lot of insights about my own life, which I'm now going to be writing in a very personal book. So the interesting thing I've realized about myself in all these 11 books that I've done, I've never mentioned myself in any of these books. I'm completely absent from them, right? Because they're all meant to be somewhat intellectual, objective exercises. And I've realized the books that have impacted me the most actually were deeply personal. Whether it's Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, or Synchronicity by Joseph Jaworski, or many others. And as Nilima told me, that which is deeply personal is also completely universal. So I'm writing a book called My Path to Inner Peace and Healing. And I'm going to share what I've learned in sort of 8 different steps that I think we all can go through in a conscious way. I kind of went through it in a sort of, it came to me in different ways, But I'm trying to share what I've learned. Hopefully that'll be of value to people on their own journeys.
Wow. I'll definitely look forward to that. I appreciate your willingness to share that. And one little anecdote that I'll share with everyone listening is oftentimes you'll be at a conscious capitalism conference and there's, hundreds of people there. And, Raj often gives kind of an opening keynote and then you'll see him throughout the conference and he is always learning and growing himself. He's in the breakout sessions and he's taking notes. I sat down one time and he came and sat down next to me, in the breakout session. So I really appreciate that you're always learning and growing and seeking, and it definitely says a lot.
Oh, thank you.
The next question that's coming through, Susan Alexander mentioned along these lines. I was thinking some similar things in terms of, we're in this survival mode right now, and you're seeing in a lot of cases it's even more difficult to, for example, be sustainable because there's so much disposable PPE and Susan is mentioning there's this heightened threat state and everyone's in survival mode. Are there ways that you're seeing either now or to move into this more healing place, or is it something where right now we really do need to just focus on survival and then as we're building back there's that opportunity? How do you see that kind of balance?
Yeah. Well, I think we can't separate the two. Our vulnerability is what connects us and unites us in this point in time. Nobody's immune to this. So many people are suffering, and the suffering is out in the open. It's visible, right? And so we cannot retreat into our own shell and say, I need to just look out for my own survival. We have to figure out how we do that together. How do we share in, some people are suffering a lot and others are barely touched by this, at least in financial terms, right? But how do we share in the collective suffering that we're going through? How do we be a part of that? To me, what this has done, I think it's awakened compassion and caring in a broader way than I had expected. And there are many companies and leaders who step forward in ways that, it was not the usual suspects that we think are going to do that. Many other companies have stepped forward to do what they can, right? I mean, there's a limit, of course, and at some point it becomes an issue of survival, and hence we've now started to see some layoffs and so forth. But before that, many companies were doing going to other mechanisms, right, to keep their people surviving and able to get through this. But I do think we are seeing that, and I think the companies that are showing up with those kinds of actions will, in fact, endure in the long term, and others who have retreated and sort of laid off people while giving bonuses to executives and just about, some have even bought back shares in this time. Some have used government money to buy back shares. I mean, those kinds of actions will come back to haunt, right? And we've also discovered the ability to cooperate much more. So much of business is based on competition alone. Competitive zeal is what drives everything. But I think this force of cooperation with other companies across industries, with governments, with nonprofits, figure out what we can do, how we can get through this together, right? And learn lessons that we are going to need. See, this pandemic is bad, of course, and the economic downturn is terrible, but it's not the worst kind of pandemic that could happen. There might be other worse pandemics in the future. In a way, this is kind of like spring training for the real deal. And hopefully we develop mechanisms about how to respond rapidly and emulate what the best. By the way, the 9 countries that did the best dealing with this crisis, all led by women. Think about that, whether it's New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, Denmark, Taiwan, Germany, and a few others, right? I mean, they got on top of this. They handled it with compassion and firmness and love, right? So again, we are learning things, and the biggest challenges are ahead of us, right? I mean, climate change. I mean, that's a massive pandemic we all have to deal with, which is much more important and doesn't seem as urgent as this one, but it certainly is urgent. So I think all of what we're learning here should help us, if we learn from it, deal with bigger challenges as we go forward, come out of this.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's a little bit scary, but it's very true to think about this as spring training for whether it's another pandemic or whether you think about that in terms of the massive cooperation that we'll need to tackle climate change. And so I'm wondering from your perspective, both with some of the economic inequalities, or you're mentioning some of the companies like the airlines are a great example that spent most of their profits over the last 10 years on share buybacks and are now asking for another bailout. Or thinking about some of the ways that we need to maybe incentivize climate change. You've always been a great champion for sharing the great stories of the companies that are conscious and there are firms of endearment and that are healing. Do you think though that there needs to be regulation, so some way to to raise the floor in terms of that, or is this something that we can just encourage the great stories?
No, I think we always need a combination of both, you know. See, we have a tendency, especially in our society, to engage in what I call bipolar thinking. It's all of this or all of this, right? And, you know, the left-right divide, or socialism, capitalism, or any of these, you know, profit and purpose. We just think of it, okay, I'm either here or I'm either here. And actually, both of those have reasons why they're important and they exist, right? So regulation, yes, good regulation is the best thing for good companies, right? Because you're not held hostage by the, you know, the lowest common denominator, the fly-by-night operators, right? It raises the playing field. And yet voluntary exchange and voluntary adoption of ideas is also important, right? So we need to do a combination of those kinds of things, right? Sound, well thought out regulation, as well as relying on higher consciousness for people to do even more from what that. You can't regulate every single thing. So I think, you know, we have to move in that direction and look at both sides of all of the polarities that we think about, which are, you know, for example, capitalism and socialism, right? I mean, a lot of people are swinging from this to that now, young people especially. And the fact is that in its pure form, it doesn't work. We know that, right? I mean, that's been shown dozens of times around the world. But the appeal of socialism, it promises decency. And human beings want, you know, decency. They want to be agents of decency in the world. And capitalism promises dynamism, and it delivers on that, right? We get innovation, we get creativity, we get creative destruction, as it is called. But we don't seem to pay much attention to decency because we're all about that, right? But so what we really want is dynamism with decency. So we want both these things. So how do we do that? I think conscious capitalism and these ideas enable us to actually have greater dynamism and true decency, where people are actually treated with respect and dignity, and they actually have the satisfaction of knowing that they have earned rather than gotten a handout, right, and made a difference in the world. So I think it's, you know, I'm speaking tomorrow actually with Barry Johnson and Richard Barrett, and I'm saying we need to bring together these two frameworks of polarity mapping as well as 7 levels of consciousness, and how do we think about these things. So yeah, it's not either or, it's always in the and finding the positives of both.
I love that. Yeah. Good regulation is the best thing for good companies. I think that's really apt. One of the interesting questions I'm getting from David, a little bit of a personal story for him, where he's saying that someone asked him if he found joy in his work, and never before had he been asked that. He's been asked previously if he enjoyed his work, but not if he found joy in it. And how would you describe the difference between the two?
Yeah. You know, I never had that experience until I had tears of joy writing Forms of Endearment. I'm writing some of the stories in that book, and I didn't even realize I was, you know, I couldn't see the screen. I said, what's happening? I said, oh my God. And I said to David Wolf, my co-author, I said, I've never had tears of joy connected to my work. I've had anger and frustration and, you know, all of that, right? But think about that. That is something to aspire to, joy at work. One of the companies I didn't talk about is Menlo Innovations, and they are all about joy at work. In fact, the CEO calls himself the Chief Joy Officer. And one of the things they did about 10 years ago, one of their employees had gone on maternity leave and was coming back, and she had her daycare arrangement set up, but it fell through. So she called to say, sorry, I can't come in. I don't have anywhere to leave the baby. And Richard Sheridan said, just bring her. You know, I said, oh, what do you mean? How are we gonna? Yeah, we all have kids. You know, we know what to do. Just bring her. You know, it's okay. So they did. She did. And you fast forward 10 years now, 26 children have grown up in that company. You know, 26 different babies have spent time there, right? So, and it's brought joy there, right? So work does not have to be grim when you're in the company of people you care about, when you're doing something meaningful, when you have a culture. Think about Southwest Airlines, right? The culture of just fun and you know, foolishness, right? And pranks and all of that. So I think it's very possible. It's the child energy. So it's that healthy child energy that we need to unleash or actually awaken within us, and make sure that's part of the culture. Right? All cultures, you know, tend to be about achievement and numbers and accountability and all of that. That's fine, but we also need joy and caring, right? And but the leader sets the tone. You know, you have to set the bar for disclosure as well as for the sort of the human, you know, side of things, right? And if you can get up to an 8 or 9, everybody will rise to a 7 or an 8. If you're stuck at a 2, nobody gets above a 1. So you have to set the tone and get that ball rolling, right? Of joy as well as humanness.
Thank you. Yeah, so Karen asked a question that might follow up on that a little bit. just wondering for companies that are struggling through COVID, looking for maybe ways to pivot. Are there ways you've seen that leaders are really healing the business and the people, through this, and when some of these financial pressures are so difficult? And then on the other hand, there's some companies that are really thriving. They are, maybe they're making plexiglass or different things that are really needed right now. Are there ways that they can maybe share the wealth or extend some of their healing beyond the walls of their company?
Yeah, no, I think many companies are doing that. I mean, they're, for example, helping their suppliers. They're paying people in advance, or they're pulling orders from the future into the present and paying suppliers now for things that they might get into the future, etc. A lot of companies are doing that. We wrote about some of these. We had a piece in HBR, which I wrote with Paul Polman a few weeks ago. You can look that up, and we had a bunch of examples in there of companies that are doing a lot of interesting things. So yeah, there are good examples out there for inspiration. One of the places I would go is Just Capital. Just Capital has a website, and where they've looked at the 100 largest companies in the country by revenue, and shown what each of them is doing in a variety of different ways. Right? And some companies show up with flying colors there, and others are sort of conspicuous by the lack of things that they're doing. But it's a good place to find examples and some inspiration.
Last question, because I know we're running short on time, but there's a couple questions around ownership. When companies are publicly traded, there's often a lot of pressure to go short term, and have the short term focus. You write a little bit about that in Firms of Endearment in terms of that pull. There's some movements towards more cooperatives or shared ownership, and I think that can at least play a role. How do you see that fitting into this conscious capitalism movement? Because sometimes people see whether it's shared ownership or different things like that, where it moves away from quote unquote capitalism. Is there a room for that kind of mixed economy in your vision?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think we had REI in Firms of Endearment, right? And that's a co-op, and that also includes customer ownership, right? So and then we have employee-owned companies as well that are quite common. I think that's a way of connecting stakeholders. When the investor and the employee are the same, that's two stakeholders that you've connected. When customers and investors become the same, I think we want to create more and more connective tissue across stakeholders. So right now, if you don't have that, of course, you've got a shared purpose and core values. If you share that, that's a lot. Then if you can go beyond that, right, with those kinds of mechanisms, that's terrific. So I think all of these are good. We need to innovate. We can't be stuck with dogma and say this is pure capitalism and this is what I'm about. No, everything evolves. Apply higher consciousness to any idea. Capitalism is an incredible thing. We need to celebrate it, but we need to elevate it. If we don't do that, we're going to decimate it. It's going to be gone, and we're going to have an extreme reaction, and we'll be Venezuela and all those kinds of places. We're going to multiply. There's far more than terrorism. The problem in the world today is economic populism and economic unrest. All the riots and things are happening around the world are not about the old terrorism types of things right now. So we have to look at all of these kinds of innovations. And public companies, I think the promising development there is the formation of a new stock exchange called the Long-Term Stock Exchange, which was approved by the SEC several months ago. I haven't looked lately as to where they are, but it's very possible companies will start listing there. And the big difference there is that the voting power that you have as a shareholder depends on how long you own your shares. So if you're an activist investor and you buy shares in Whole Foods and tomorrow you show up and demand that they fire their board and do all kinds of things, you would not have that power under this system, because a true investor would be empowered, but speculators would not be empowered. So you can't just come in and change. You're just basically trying to extract value from that company. So I think aligning interests of stakeholders together and truly making it a long-term proposition, I think would go a long way in healing our public markets, which need a lot of healing. Number of public companies is down 50%, compared to a couple of decades ago. And we don't have a healthy public market. We don't have healthy, retirements and pensions and all of those. Where is that money going to go if we don't have a healthy public market to invest it in?
Thank you so much. Well, we could go on all day, but I really do appreciate your time. Just fascinating and really inspiring. And I would highly encourage anybody who hasn't already to pick up the Healing Organization. So there are several examples of different industries, different challenges that these companies are tackling that really will inspire you and hopefully give you some ideas for how to bring it into your own organization. And then the other thing that I'll mention is that Raj, after writing Firms of Endearment, many people got inspired by those stories and said, okay, that's great. How do we get started? And so there's also a conscious capitalism field guide that you can pick up and has different exercises to try, different things that you can do personally or with your team. So there's a lot of ways to get started, and stay tuned on our social media channels, and in our newsletter, we'll be having a few book giveaways so that you can continue to educate yourself, but definitely check those out. The only other thing that I'll mention is if we're coming back over the next 3 weeks for this virtual conference. Many of you may have heard that the Black Agenda Group here locally named racism as a public health crisis. And so we're having a conversation next Wednesday at 3 on how not only is racism a public health crisis, but it should be a business imperative. Businesses really need to, take this on as really part and parcel of what they're doing. And you can see that how that aligns with this healing organization mindset. The following week on the 22nd, we'll be having a conversation on how to make a more inclusive entrepreneurial community. And on the 29th, we'll be having a conversation on organizational cultures that heal. And so we do have actually a couple of local examples. So Raj mentioned Menlo. We had Menlo. We had Richard Sheridan as our keynote for our in-person conference last year. So many of you may have heard that Menlo story. Also included in the healing organization are FIFCO, which is the parent company of Genesee Brewery, which is here locally in Rochester. And many of the very healing practices that FIFCO started are starting to trickle down into the Genesee practices. And lastly is Greyston Bakery, as he mentioned, is they actually have a now center for open hiring where they're sharing this really innovative concept of having no interviews, no background checks, no drug tests. You basically put your name on a waiting list, and then you get hired into this training program. And we actually have the very first pilot of that outside of Yonkers in Rochester, New York. And one of our sponsors, Clean Crafts, was in Thai Hookway. It was instrumental in getting that started here. And we also have Mubarak Bashir is actually on the line right now and is the one that is leading those efforts here in Rochester. So stay tuned for a lot of conversations, not only about this big picture and how we can really heal our society and our planet, but also how we can do that locally. And as we talk about here in the upstate New York region, how can we make conscious capitalism an economic development strategy for our region? So thank you all for joining us today. We hope that we will see you at a future one of these virtual conference sessions. Raj, thank you so much both for your time today, but more importantly for your thought leadership. And I think we're all looking forward to that book forthcoming.
Thank you. I have to write it now, so that's my work. Thank you, Andrew. Happy to be with you, and thanks for organizing this.